Distraction makers.
All right. So this is your last warning.
Mine?
No.
You looked at me.
Them.
Okay.
You've clicked on this video, and we're about to ruin games for you.
Sorry.
If you have changed your mind and would like to continue to enjoy games, you should click away.
In all seriousness, actually, no, like that is pretty serious.
Yeah,
I do sincerely think what we're going to talk about, I don't want to bury the lead. I do sincerely think like incorporating this and starting to understand things on a fundamental level with games, this being one of them, was one of the things that started to, I don't want to say didn't have me enjoy games, but I will say that I've played games at a game table at a game night, and people wonder if I'm having fun because I'm staring at the game like this and looking all around. And it's because I'm in that mode where I'm like, what's happening under the hood of all of this? What's going on?
Yeah, this is a peek into how the hot dog's made a little bit.
Yeah.
And so if you want to continue to enjoy your glizzies, look away.
Before we start talking about essential games today, please, if you like our content, give us a little like and subscribe and maybe a comment. Also, if you are interested in joining our Discord, you can find a link to that in the description down below.
Back to the video. So I think we should first start with the Soren Johnson quote.
Sure.
That given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of games. So what we're going to be talking about is a technique that we use to identify when a game is easily optimized to the point where it sort of ceases to be a game. And the terminology that we sort of use for this is that we're sort of peeling layers back to the essential game, which usually is determined by how you win the game. That's like step one, is identify what type of game you're dealing with, whether it's a game, the sort of categories of games that we look at are conquest, survival, and mastery. And these sort of present as conquest is usually like PvP, player versus player. Survival is player versus environment or player versus system. And mastery is technically it's like player versus self. It can also be viewed as like a race. So once you've sort of identified the type of game that you're playing, you're going to look at, all right, well, what is the only thing that matters in this game? And the only thing that matters is how you win. Once you've identified that, you can sort of start to layering back on the things that are getting in your way of winning and identifying what's the path of least resistance to winning the game.
I think that to preface this, because I can already feel like some people that are watching this might be like, oh, wow, sweaty tryhards over here. We're not talking about this from a player's perspective necessarily. We are talking about this from a designer's perspective, knowing that players will do this, right? That's why you started with the Soren Johnson quote, is that like, even if you have a lighthearted, quote unquote, casual game, there will be players that, given the opportunity, will try to win most efficiently. And if it's seen that maybe if luck is too much or whatever, their efficiency of trying to win the game just is outweighed by other factors, then they might then lean back towards, okay, this is just casual. But given any opportunity, if they are achieving any sort of movement towards the win condition through their actions, they'll just win more often. And so as designers, we're trying to be aware of this, not trying to be like, yeah, players, listen here, but also players will probably find this useful too. So.
Right. Really, the issue is that if you're not aware of this as a designer, your game can easily enter strategic collapse without you even realizing that that's what's going on, where a player has found the sort of most essential parts of your game, has figured out how to exploit them, and then once that player does it, other players are seeing them do it, and everybody just ends up doing the same actions, and the game's over. That's it. It ceases to be replayable. It ceases to be maybe even playable at that point. And so, this is something that we end up, a technique that we kind of use to identify these problems in games that we are critiquing or like looking at, giving feedback on, that kind of thing, to see like, okay, how close is this to being a non-viable game?
Which we've brought up on the channel before, that like a way that we've explored this with Magic is like play Magic in its most essential form, which is like vanilla creatures basically, and nothing else, just lands and vanilla creatures. Technically, you can go one step further away from that if you want to start abstracting the game from what it like you could just get naturally for cards. But that's the best way of trying to determine, like, okay, what is this game in its most essential state? What are you trying to do? And like, what are you able to do as a player? And then from there, you can start to progress and figure out, I guess, foo strategies, whatever.
Right, foo, first order optimal. So one of the best stories from Magic's history to illustrate this point that we're talking about is the combo, I guess, of Channel Fireball. Is that in early days of Magic, there wasn't any kind of a limit on the number of cards that you could play in your deck. And so early on, players found out that if they play the card Channel, and they play the card Fireball, and they play Black Lotus, and then they have basically all mountains for their lands, that they can win the game turn one by basically paying 19 of their life and dealing 20 damage to their opponent, and the game's over. And this particular strategy illustrates exactly what is most important in Magic, which is getting your opponent to 0. And this was the most effective way to do that at the time, in terms of I don't have to interact with my opponent at all. I don't even give my opponent the opportunity to interact with me because I'm probably killing them turn one. And you end up in this sort of solved state of Magic where if everybody is doing this, it's just whoever goes first.
And it's also just because of the level of consistency, right? It's not just because like, oh, now we still have 2 card combos. This is technically a 4 card combo if you want to see it that way. But it's a 4 card combo that you can do, like you said, prior to interaction and insanely consistent because there was not the 4 card limitation.
Right. And so when we are viewing a game under that lens and go, okay, well, this is just the most optimal thing to do, you can start to put on some guardrails, which is things like, oh, well, you can only have 4 copies of each card. But then we start to move into strategies like mono red burn, right? Where mono red burn starts to, it is effectively doing this same thing. It's just doing it at a slower pace. And so life totals in Magic are what is called a set point, which is a number that all of the sort of other cards in the game are balanced around. So if you're trying to make sure that the game is going to last for 3, 4, 5 turns, you probably have a target amount given like sort of the competitive nature of different formats, where like standard is probably the format that should take the longest to end the game. Well, longest meaning you probably get to turn 5 in standard. Modern, you probably get to turn 3 or 4. Legacy, sometimes you get to turn 0 through 2 or something, right? Like there's a spectrum of the power level of any given individual card that sort of finishes the game faster. But the strategy of mono red burn is still viable in all of those formats because it gets so close to the heart of the essential game of Magic, which is just getting your opponent to zero health.
We've seen some games that are aware of having that foo strategy and trying to subvert it.
Yeah, I would say Magic's one of them, right?
Right.
Like
Magic,
they changed the rules because of this particular interaction.
Right. And it took, I mean...
It took them a little while.
It took a little while, but it took a little while for players to figure out that was a thing they could do. Yeah. And then there are some games that seem to not be aware of this. And I think it's the games that are not aware of this that is dangerous. And that's why, like, a lot of the times you'll see a new card game come out, and if the system is too different from other traditional conventions of card games, usually Magic, then those games usually will have some early bans, erratas, whatever, and it's usually to subvert something like this, where there is probably some sort of a foo strategy, and whether that is leaning a little bit more toward, like, obviously, ideally, let's look at Altered, right? Altered has recently been doing some erratas for some cards. Their goal is somewhat different from Magic's. Magic's is lowering a point from 20 to 0. Theirs is getting a point up from 0 to 5.
Right, because you're
essentially,
yeah. So you're in Altered, just so everybody is on the same page. You have a bar, so like a progress bar in the middle of the table. You have two player tokens that start. One starts on one side, one starts on the other, representing you and your companion, and you're trying to be the first one to get them to meet on a space together. Whether that's moving one character all the way across the board, or it's moving one character one direction, the other character towards that one, and meeting somewhere. Ultimately, you have to move 5 spaces. Well, the thing with Altered is that the game has sort of put a cap on the progress you can make in any individual turn, right? Because you can only you and your opponent's pieces can only move 1 space, right? So the most you can move is 2 spaces, because your piece can move 1 and your companion piece on the other side can move 1. But basically, you're just looking for any place to break parity with your opponent, right? Because once you do, now they're put in a position where they have to break parity with you again, right? So this is kind of the who's the beatdown thing in Magic. We're not going to get totally into that, but basically what it means is if the game state continues to progress exactly as it is, you want to be the person who's going to win as long as things continue in the direction that they are. That puts you in an advantageous position, which is called the beatdown in Magic.
Right.
In Altered, it's probably called something else, like you're the hug guy. I don't know.
They'll still probably call it the beatdown.
Yeah, but it's not a violent game.
It is. But, and the only reason that you can do that in a game like Altered is because there's two different sides you can go on. You either try to take control of one side of the board or the other side of the board. So yeah, once you somehow then have one advantage, you only have to go to one side of the board while your opponent has to try to score one side and stop you from scoring on another side, splitting their resources. Yep. Doesn't mean that it's not possible, but that's where like variance of the game is hopefully going to make up for that somehow. And that's not as reliable. Another example of this is the game Balatro. Which we have recently been exploring and playing because it was nominated for Game of the Year. But one thing that we noticed, I guess I pointed out to you early on, and we haven't done the exact math, but like fairly sure that we're accurate on this, is that early on in the game, basically flushes are what you should go for. Flushes are the most consistent thing to try and get with your hand that gives you the highest reward possible. That will essentially let you score the first like level or two of that game. And anything beyond that point, any upgrades you might get in that game is only going to then benefit flushes. It doesn't mean that through variance, through different forms of things, that flushes then become less optimal, but it's essentially the most optimal thing
from baseline.
Yeah,
and part of the reason why is because it's the highest scoring hand that moves the most cards out of your hand. It's like the highest scoring, most consistent hand that moves 5 cards out of your hand. Because once you discard them, you play the hand, you get to drop back up to your hand size. Those cards are removed from your deck, and you can continue to put more flushes together to move through more cards. Right. So that's essentially what's going on.
And it seems to be some sort of an inside community joke that all builds are flushes. So.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's contrast a bit with, 1v1 Magic and Commander, right? So 1v1 Magic is very much focused on this. I'm trying to get my opponent from 20 to 0, and I'm trying to do that in the most efficient way possible. There's only one other opponent, and so the game pieces that have been balanced around 20 hit points are designed to do that, right? So when we move into the Commander territory, you're against 3 other opponents with 40 life each, so that's this thing that we've talked about quite a few times before, where you're trying to do 120 damage with cards that are designed to be dealing with one opponent with 20 health, right? So you end up shifting. This is like a pretty massive baseline shift of Magic systems, and its goal really was to like broaden the horizons of what is playable. But unfortunately, when you do this, you end up with less cards in an optimal setting that are viable, because you're looking again for the path of least resistance to win the game, which is I'm just trying to get all of my opponents from 40 life to 0 immediately and just win the game instantly. And there's only so many cards that do that most efficiently, which is Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation / Tainted Pact, and Underworld Breach, Brain Freeze combos, basically.
Right. Magic ends in 3 ways. Either you end by lowering, I'll say Commander, you end by lowering everybody to 0, you end by lowering everyone's dex to 0, or you have some sort of an instant win con. And so when everyone's decks are now bigger and there's 3 decks to try and mill, and everyone's life totals are doubled and there's 3 life totals to lower, instant win cons are the exact same level of consistency pretty much, even in a singleton format. And again, this is mechanical, right? Like these things, technically, if you were to look at Commander in a vacuum, right, as an early design, and you're just playing spells and you just have mana, you could make this game recognize, the political direct interactions of all that stuff, and it could be built from the ground up with its lightning bolt dealing 6 damage to every player for 1 red or something. And every mechanic is built around that. But because it's sort of splitting between these 2 formats, it's taking one essential game and it's conflicting with another essential game mechanically, which is why it's so hard to design for.
How do we combat this problem?
Essential games are always going to be a thing. The problem, I think, comes when it's not recognized as from a designer's perspective. You should recognize what is the most optimal strategy, and is that being subverted somehow through variance in various means, right? Whether it's through interaction of players, through its variance of randomness, of output randomness, of cards that you draw, whatever that might be, making it so that something could potentially stop somebody.
I think the first thing that we end up doing then is identifying doing your best to identify what the foo strategy is. And then you sort of have to put roadblocks in the way that make it so that foo strategy is less viable. Sometimes these are somewhat ham-fisted, I guess, where you're like, you have to do like actual system level restrictions, like what Magic had to do when you had to move down to only 4 copies of each card.
And what Yu-Gi-Oh! Refused to do.
Right. It's such like a brute force solution.
Right.
You know, like
technically, I guess a ban list is doing that as well, but
right. And specifically in player versus player characters, player versus player games, your opponent is part of the way that you solve this. So if you have a system that has this sort of interaction that is subverting all of the player interaction in the game, I don't have to then go through whatever my opponent is doing before I can just win the game. This is why Channel Fireball was so powerful, is you're just bypassing whatever strategy your opponent might be doing to try to win the game. I think this is also why we ended up seeing more of a focus on creatures in Magic, is that creatures inherently have more interaction than spells. But, you know, in the case of Channel Fireball, Force of Will, putting sort of tools of interaction into your players' hands is good. I think Force of Will is kind of a band-aid where you really want the systems of the game forcing interaction so that you have to actually have a game to win the game, right? If you can just completely subvert the interaction and just win the game, why is your opponent even there?
To me, Force of Will feels like the Yu-Gi-Oh! Solution.
Yeah, a little bit.
Where, it's like, okay, there's this OTK that you could pull out. Well, what if we had hand traps, which is what Yu-Gi-Oh! Literally made, which is spells that essentially have no mana cost, and you have no idea someone even has it,
right?
And they just can play it that way.
Do you have it? I'm trying to win the game. Can you stop me?
Yeah.
Oh, you did? Okay.
And then they have to ask, do you have a second one?
Right.
The next time I try this.
And the one of the clearest examples of this in Magic 2 is also that when you attack, you have to attack through your opponent's creatures, right? So it's not, I get to attack and I choose to attack your face. It's, I'm attacking, you get to choose whether or not you're blocking, right? And that kind of comes with its own problems, kind of, but at least you know at a systems level baseline that some amount of interaction probably needs to happen in the game in order for somebody to win the game. Except for in the case of, burn or whatever. So it's still a problem, but you can at least limit that stuff to, all right, well, it can only deal 3 damage, a turn or whatever.
Right.
So,
3
damage a card.
No more channel fireballs.
Right. We don't have a one mana spell that deals 19 damage.
I think something just as like small extra design insight that I think is important and commonly kind of missed when talking about essential games with other designers is that I think it's important to figure out what the bare bones system is of your game. And when we're figuring out what the essential game is, it's like the most minimal mechanics possible.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier to spot this kind of stuff.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of people, when they end up playing these sort of essential games and figuring out what's wrong, they're like, oh, well, I don't need to test this and figure out what my game is because I know it's not going to work super well, or I know the depth is lost or something like that at this bare bones level, but it really needs these 3 or 4 mechanics, and then the game is really good. And I think at that point, you have to start questioning whether or not those mechanics should be implemented directly. Are you taking the Magic approach, or are you doing the Yu-Gi-Oh! Approach, basically? I think those are the two
right.
design philosophies. Magic is like, okay, systems level, we got to make this adjustment. We got to change this. And Yu-Gi-Oh! Was like, we're going to make Heavy Storm a card. You don't know what Heavy Storm does, but I'll send you so you can put it on screen.
Okay.
Yeah, how's it feel?
Fine.
All right.
the optimization is sort of inevitable, right? And this is one of the reasons why Magic has been able to exist for as long as it has, is it continually reinvents itself. I will die on this hill. Standard is still the best way to play Magic. And the reason why is because the solvability of the format goes away every so often. 3-year rotation is a terrible idea. Like 2 years probably minimum, or maximum, I guess. I would much rather, at this point, I think that you can rotate Standard once a year. That's how many sets used to be in Standard. My point is that optimization is inevitable. As a designer, you have to do everything you can to slow it down, especially in the age of the internet. This has like been turbocharged. The players that do play for optimization will ruin the fun for players that don't. And what's funny is Commander, I think this is where the sort of protectivism of Commander ends up coming in.
Yeah.
Where you have so many players that don't want to play this way, that trying to just keep other people out. Right?
I think so
people
many
that
players
do optimize
didn't play this way, that now that there's more players that are playing this way, it's sort of like people were blinded or they had covers on and they didn't want to look at like what was actually happening. And no, like your game can also be optimized efficiently, actually more efficiently than you might like to admit.
Yeah, and it's tough, right? Because you can't really like leave this up to the community to solve, right? Like it's not something that you can peer pressure people out of. It's
right.
it's inevitable, and the game systems have to be what solves for it.